I am your brother in Christ, and welcome back to our Sunday live stream. This online church that we are doing during this quarantine. Ooh, so much fun. Today we will be covering only one topic, just because this one gets so deep. Let's go ahead and dive into that question. The question being, is there a secular explanation for the conquest and foundation of Israel? So, that being our overall question that we want to investigate, we'll be looking at historical references as well as doing some extrapolation and just thinking of this logically. So first of all, the question is, why on earth am I doing this? Why is a Christian YouTuber doing this? Well, it's very simple. First of all, I'm not a Jew by blood or by religion, obviously. Your brother in Christ wouldn't make much sense if I was a Jew. So, the next question is why? Well, in truth, Judaism is the foundation of Christianity. It was basically the vanguard. It was what God chose to use in order to give us our redemption. So without Judaism, there would not be any Christianity. So that being said, if the Jewish texts, as far as the Torah, was corrupted and evil or just wrong historically, then that would throw Christianity into question. So, first of all, we'll be looking at some of the events in Exodus, looking at Egypt, a little bit about that, and then a little bit on Israel's travels. And then finally, this is where we'll be mostly focusing it on. We'll be looking at how, at least the initial invasion of Canaan happened. So, let's go ahead and take a look at this. Now, some of this will be based upon my humanities studies that I did while in college. No, I'm going to nip the argument in the bud for most of you who will go down there in the comment section and say, well, yes, if you attend a Christian college. But no, in truth, it was not a Christian college. I was not working on a theology degree. I was working on my bachelor's of electrical engineering. And the class was taught by a devout atheist, which led to a little bit of arguments between me and him, in which he was not able to answer any of the questions very well. But let's go ahead and dive into some of the things we do know. So with that being the foundation, if anyone in the comments says, oh, you went to a Christian college, that means you don't know anything, or you don't go to a college that I deem is credible. Oh crap. This was a college course. It was from an accredited college. And it was a secular college. So, yeah, I don't have much ground to stand on that one. So let's take a look. First of all, due to archaeological evidence that we have discovered in Egypt, yes, a large group of slaves did leave Egypt at about the same time that Exodus claims the Israelites left. Now, there's a little bit of wiggle room in there because our discoveries aren't, unless they get this date at this time, we don't really have that. But we do know that there was a mass number of slaves that left Egypt during that time, and that, yes, Egypt did trade in slaves and had a very active slave economy. So, after that, we know that they traveled throughout. Sorry, losing my train of thought there for a moment. According to Exodus, after they did leave, they traveled through the desert and then arrived right away at the Promised Land, which then they sent in spies, which we see the story through there if you're familiar with it. Basically, all but two of the spies came back and said, we can't do this. This land is full of giants. There's no way we can take this over. They have been healthy. They got great resources. It's beautiful land, but no, they're going to kick our butts. Two of them came back and said, yes, we can do it through God. If we look at this story, now again, I'm trying to take this out, take God out of it as much as possible in order to try to figure out if there's a secular explanation for what we know historically happened. But this one is actually kind of critical because it's how they were looking at their enemy. Their description of their enemy. If you look throughout history, definitely World War I, World War II, you can see a lot of different propaganda from both sides. Always depicting the enemy as either weak, inferior, barbaric, whatever they wanted to display the enemy as. At no point do they ever want to show the enemy as this powerful, overwhelming force that there's no way they could ever face it. So if we apply the principle of embarrassment to this, we can see that yes, the Israelites wouldn't want to put themselves into this most embarrassing position of saying, well, we didn't trust God, therefore we had to go through the desert. If they're going to make up a story, then you would want to have a better explanation than that. So that being said, now my wife did point out when I was going through this and talking to her about it that, well, we do have stories from fables of examples of bad people, examples to scare people into line, such as if you think of The Boy Who Cried Wolf and others examples like that. But in every fable example like that, the people who are being the fools are not the people who are in authority founding your nation. You would want them to look as good as possible, and in this case, they really look like a bunch of idiots. So that would make no sense. So, now, due to archaeological discoveries, we can also roughly estimate where the Israelites entered Canaan. So we know that they were in Egypt, we know that they left Egypt, and we know that they did enter into Canaan. So we know historically that A, B, and C happened. B, their travels are left to interpretation because you have the Red Sea, you have God intervening a lot. Most secular historians would throw those out as fables. We're going to disregard those at this point just because we're trying to explain it. We say that they got from point A to point B to point C somehow. And they're about ready to invade Canaan. But we know that this is the second generation. So, and finally, we do know historically that the Israelites did take over Canaan. We know this for a fact that they did establish Israel, the nation. So we know those as historical facts. But that leads us into the but. What can we glean off of this? So, what we are going to try to focus on is the historical evidence that we see and extrapolate using our own common knowledge in order to try to find the truth of this matter and answer our original pre-stated question. So, based upon what we just talked about, we know that the first generation of Israelites were slaves in Egypt. That means that they would have been used to hard labor, they would have been built, they wouldn't have had the best diet, but they would have had at least a decent diet because, I mean, what use are weak, pathetic slaves to their slave masters, after all? So, we know they would have been used to heavy labor, and they would have been in decent to good health. But as far as it comes to weapons and armor, they wouldn't have had any at all, other than just makeshift tools and maybe some makeshift weapons that maybe turned a scythe they used to use for harvesting into a tool. We do know that they had animals with them, so they would have had the tools necessary for that. But we're not talking about anything that would be military grade at the time at all. And that's the first generation. They're not even the ones that invaded Canaan, according to our story of embarrassment that we listed there. It's the second generation that came in to invade Canaan. So what do we know about the second generation? The second generation of Israelites would have been raised in the desert. They would not have been used to the same amount of hard labor that the first generation would have been. In fact, they would have been desert nomads, basically, is how they would have lived. Their diet would have comprised of just what they could have found, locusts, whatever they could grab their hands on during that time. Now, yes, according to the Bible, God did intervene and he gave them plenty of food and plenty of water. But since, again, we are looking at this from a secular standpoint, we're going to go ahead and take that and disregard that and say that all we really know is that they were wandering in the desert and that they could only eat what we know that they would have eaten during that time, and that their diet would have been poor. So they're not used to the hard labor that their first generation would have been. The tools and weapons that they might have had during the first generation have degraded. They might have been able to find or possibly traded for other tools. But then again, we're not looking at anything that would be terribly military grade. So we're looking at a group of desert rats, basically. To use actually my professor's term. He referred to them as desert rats invading Canaan. So, yeah, his opinion of Jews was not the best. So, looking at historical Canaan. So, we know that Canaan was not one big nation. They were broken up into well-fortified city-states, or small nations, I guess you'd call it, of maybe 3 or 4 city-states that have combined together in order to form a small nation. The inhabitants did fight against each other quite often. They were very warlike. They were very capable warriors. So, armed with this information, we can see on one hand, we have the Israelites that were a united force. They did have that on their side. They were a united force. But they are a desert-dwelling people armed with tools and makeshift weapons. On top of that, they had no war experience. These were slaves. Well, not even slaves. They were sons and daughters of slaves who have not participated in war in many, many generations. Because according to both our historical evidence of Egypt and Exodus, when they left Egypt, it wasn't warlike. They did not fight. It was a peaceful leaving. So we know they have not had any combat experience. They've never had to build siege weapons. They've never had to lay siege to a city. And yet they are trying to invade a divided, which is in their advantage, a divided people. But they are very war experienced. According to the Israelites, they're giants, which could have just meant that, yes, they had good food and they were 6'1" or 6'2". Would have definitely been considered giants at that time. So they had well fortified cities. They had standing armies. Even if I didn't study in depth the art of war and look at this with a tactical mindset, this looks like a very bad idea. Let's take a bunch of these daughters and sons of slaves, arm them with hammers and maybe a couple sickles and charge them at Jericho. I mean, this was the first city that they went up against. Look at that. That's a well-fortified, ready-to-go city who has withstood assaults before and has changed hands multiple times during its history. So, this is very easy to see that the Israelites stood very little chance. And the very fact that we know historically that they were able to pull this off violates every basic tenet of tactics. So the next question I would have is, since we know that the Israelites did invade, we know that they're the second generation, we know all this information, are there other historical references of a small group of people in comparison invading a much larger fortified nation or city-states? Are there historical references of this? And the answer is yes. Yes, we do have historical references to a lot of small groups of natives defending against larger invading forces, even overwhelming invading forces. And there are a few references that I've been able to find to a smaller group invading a larger group. In fact, there are two. So let's go ahead and take a look at those two references and see if we could apply this to the situation. Maybe they use similar tactics. Maybe something along those lines. So let's go ahead and take a look. First of all, we have the invasion of England by William the Conqueror. Now, there's a lot of history to this one. There's a lot of backstory for this one. First of all, William the Conqueror came in. He was Duke of Normandy. Before that, he was facing off against King Harold of England. And prior to that, there was just a three-way tie, basically, for the crown of England, with Harold Hardrada, King Harold, and the William the Conqueror. So you had a three-way tie there. A lot of politics going back and forth to make history sound simple. Basically, King Harold had to go up north to fight Harold Hardrada. If I could say those words right. The second Harold. There's too many Harolds in this story. Up north to fight the second Harold, which was a Viking coming in from up north. King Harold won the day, victory, and at the same time he heard down south the Normans had invaded, so William the Conqueror had invaded, so he force marched his guys back down south, and promptly lost very badly. Very close battle, actually. If you study that, it's a very interesting piece of history there. But is this relevant to what we were looking for? Is this battle and this war relevant? No, we can't apply the same tactics because this was an invading army, yes, but they were also battle-hardened. Everyone in the story was some sort of Viking or half Viking. King Harold was half Viking. William the Conqueror was a Viking. This other Harold Hardrada was a Viking. So these were people who were well versed in war, who were well capable. These were armies facing off against each other. This was not a small force from the desert fighting a much larger encamped force. No, that one really is not. We cannot use this as a historical reference. So the next one. So which one? This one actually has some serious promise here. We are looking at the invasion of Mexico by Hernán Cortés. So yeah, fast forwarding a little bit. Hey, Hernán Cortés had a smaller force. Granted, they were veterans. They were equipped with weapons accordingly. They were actually equipped with superior firearms and military tactics than the natives that they were invading. But they were still a smaller force invading a larger force. So would this be a situation that we could see that, yes, this might have been something similar historically? No, unfortunately not. We can't use this reference. Although, yes, the Aztec nation was divided up with basically the Aztecs up top with a bunch of smaller little tribes underneath them. Very similar to the city-state design of Canaan. But you still had one overall controlling force, and basically, putting a long story short, Cortés used the other natives in order to overthrow the Aztec Empire. And the other natives were kind of ticked off that the Aztecs were constantly demanding tribute from all their subordinate nations. And their tribute was not in the form of gold or food, but in children. And if you know anything about the Aztec nation, then you know that they did human sacrifice. In fact, they would cut the heart out of the children once a day in order to make sure the sun rose the next day. You can say that kind of ticked off the other nations. So no, that would not be relevant to the situation. If we look at history, there are a couple other occasions. I've disregarded a lot of them just because they're either one or two quick little battles. What we're really looking for is a complete invasion of a nation that was well fortified, and an invading army that was, needless to say, not. Or well equipped, even. So, the question we had at the beginning of this, because I always want to go back, it always annoys me when you have a video that says a question at the beginning and then does not address the question at the end. Like, okay, well, what is the result? So the question at the beginning that we did was, is there a secular explanation for the conquest and founding of Israel? The answer is really no. It makes no logical sense that slaves that we know about, we know they were slaves in Egypt, crossed over somehow, got to Canaan, and then was able to invade and conquer well-fortified cities in order to establish a nation. There really is not any sort of reference throughout history, unless we're starting to talk about time travelers. And yes, I did see that Christian time travelers give the Israelites guns. That would make more sense. Actually, that's it. Basically the only secular argument you could use is that somehow we eventually invent time travel and Christians decide to go back and give the Israelites guns. I'm gonna be honest, that's a little far-fetched. Just throwing that out there. It's much easier to believe in a god than it is to believe that time travelers somehow violated the laws of physics in order to give the Israelites the guns, and we have no evidence of those guns. So it would be the only thing that could make secular sense, I guess, in this case. So no, this would have to be an act of God in order for them to be able to take over a well-fortified nation. I mean, the first city that they went up against was extremely well fortified. We did see that earlier on. We did look through that. There we go. Yeah, I clicked on the wrong slide. Ancient Jericho. This was the first nation that they went against. The first city that they went against. The state that went against in order to conquer. They should have been nothing but water against a stone. Should have washed away without anything. And history should never... It wouldn't have even noticed these slaves who came up against this great city. That's what secular logic tells us. Removing God from the equation. So the only thing we're left with is that this had to be an act of God. Thank you guys so much for joining me. I am working on... I was hoping to do both of these today, but it's just... This took up so much of my time that I wasn't able to complete our next next video will be on is there historical evidence for Christianity? I'll be focusing mostly on the death and resurrection of Jesus Christ, because that's where we really come down to as being the foundation of the theology of Christianity. That's really their main holding structure, is that Jesus died and rose again. If he did not die, then Christianity makes no sense. If he did not rise again, Christianity again makes no sense. So both of those would have to occur for Christianity to have any sort of historical evidence or relevancy in this. So we're going to examine that, take a look at that next week. I just need some more time to put that together. I normally try to do 3 of these, but this week I'm only doing 1. So thank you guys so much for joining us. Like, subscribe, and again, check us out on Gab, BitChute, YouTube, and what was the other one? Oh yes, Minds, which always seems to get away from me, so my mind is always constantly leaving me, and I get off on a rabbit trail, such as spending 4 hours just examining how the invasion of England happened by William the Conqueror. So thank you guys so much for joining us, and as always, God be with us.